And Michael gave us a lesson as to why our gas prices are going up. So I'd like to do is open it up for questions for everyone. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the question that I have is, if we look at the Katrina example and case study that you had, you said that we got a 10 to 20 cent rise. Did you break that increase down as to which sector, the production and import, transportation versus the retail distribution, and where the significant increase was?
No, I didn't do that specifically, sir, honestly. The two parts that were kind of major affected by that were those the transportation with those very large crude carriers. Most of their offload ability is located in the Gulf Coast because there's only a certain number of ports that can handle such a ship. A ship as large as that. It was that, and then also the refineries that I talked about. So those are the two major factors that went into that price increase.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Martin Rutger, Carleton University, Canada. Your largest supplier of energy. Thanks, Mike. And thank you. Economists, two elements you may want to take into account in your analysis. And that's to do with supply constraint by external suppliers to the United States. Because as you point out, half your consumption is met by foreign suppliers. And some foreign suppliers are subject to what we'll call political constraints on supply, which drive up American domestic prices because your local producer will meet international prices. Two examples. You source in Africa predominantly Nigeria, predominantly an area which is subject to terrorist attacks at the what used to be called Biafra, now it's the Biafra Gulf. And secondly, Canada. We have a number of external organizations attempting to control and constrain supply from Alberta to the United States with a deliberate intention of avoiding violating Canadian law and punishing the United States. And you might want to do some research into both dimensions, the terrorist attacks on Nigerian supply and political manipulations driving or constraining Canadian production to export to the United States.
Thank you very much, sir.
That's good. Yes, ma'am.
Also for Cadet Risberger, I'm Ann Solon from Drexel University in Philadelphia. Speaking of supply, I don't know if you saw in your research at all, but I recently learned that coal can be converted to gas. Did you find that in your research at all?
That wasn't an area that I looked at specifically, ma'am. I did see some of that too in terms of, I think it was talking about oil shale, which I think might be what you're talking about, but I didn't go into that specifically as far as my analysis.
That might help with the price.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, Bob O'Brien from a couple of places, retired from New York City Transit. I'm with InfraGuard. I'm taping this for the IGTV. But a question for Professor Talone about the models. Is there a shared body of knowledge about those models that people can tap into across industry or across different companies?
There's not a single body of knowledge that we tap into. So how we have approached this is working with subject matter experts for the particular region that we may have interest. And depending upon which region you may be looking at, some of that knowledge is transferable. So we build these knowledge representations, but there's not that I'm aware of, a single ontology. We've looked at several of them. DHS has as their ontological model that includes infrastructure and essential services, and there are others. We've taken an agnostic approach to that because we realize that we may need to incorporate models that adhere to these various ones that they're after. So there's not a single standard. Okay. There are multiple ones that we
need to. Then a follow-up, you might want to look at what they've done with the GIS. They've tried to reduce it to one or two standards, and with the common data dictionary. The more easier it is, then people can pick up on it.
It really does make a difference if you do have that single ontology representation. And at this point, we try to live with the reality that one doesn't exist. And if we had that, that would be the best. So the folks that we support, they have a single representation that we then extend to do the interdependency and knit the models together. And so then we have that benefit. But in lieu of one of those, we have to deal with multiple different representations. So, thank you.
Mitch?
Yeah, my name is Mitch Erickson. I'm with DHS Science and Technology. Both the gentlemen in the back talking about Alberta, and then the last slide, I believe it was with Cadet Risberger and the Kandahar Towers, are examples of threats. And as you're going through each, for all four of you gentlemen, as you were going through your process, I'm sure in your idle moments you had some notions of threats that you could come up. I mean, we can all dream up, threats from the most, the most mundane to the most fantastic. And what I wanted to know, my question is as you were going through your projects, did you in fact find yourself maturing your thought processes on what threats are viable and serious, and sort of doing mental prioritization of threats? So any one of you guys that wants to jump on that one?
Well, I think I absolutely did, sir. As I said in the beginning, I had about 4 days experience when I started with this project. So I really knew nothing going into this. So as far as I had never thought of packing explosives into a tank and truck. I had never thought of attacking the refineries as a way to attack America. So I'd say in terms of my personal development, absolutely.
I'd go to add on to that is as I looked at each sector that I wanted to discuss, you find yourself, whether it be sitting on a ferry, you think worst case scenario. And I think that doesn't happen often enough unless you're becoming aware of what your surroundings are. So being able to look at it through a formidable sense of vision, that really does come into play when you're doing your research, is what could happen to me right now, and absolutely.
Quick follow on, and then we just had the disaster at the Holland Tunnel last night, which, for those of you not paying attention, about 12 miles from here, the Holland Tunnel got shut down for about 4 hours because some police action, and many people had their weekend ruined because they were backed up for 10, 12 miles last night.
Let me mention what Scott had said while he was giving his presentation. He talked about freight, removal of freight, and in parentheses supply chain. And as I mentioned in my presentation, the importance of the movement of chemicals is large, has to be done physically. Okay, and in this case, many of it is done by truck and rail. The important thing what Scott raised again was it transcends not just to chemicals, but it transcends to almost everything else, because everything else is going to get moved by air, by train, by truck, in some fashion or form. And perhaps as part of being in attendance in a symposium like this, we will slowly become more educated and become more aware of how dependent we are on these types of things.
I can just extend that a little farther. There is a gap that I guess this was a known gap that hopefully this kind of work can help fill, and that is having that expertise that extends across a single discipline. Right? We have our power engineers, they know a lot about power, right? How to generate it, how to transmit it, so forth. But that's where the boundary ends. That's their expertise tends to end there. Right? We have people that are transportation experts, logistics experts, but they may know very little about power. Right? You keep going from one sector to the next, and so one of the greater awareness that I experienced was not just my own understanding of this kind of the collective behaviors and complexities, vulnerabilities, and threats, but also that there is this gap that we need to start filling with people that also build that kind of expertise as well. And we can't really look at things in isolation anymore. We may feel very comfortable because we're sitting within the fences and feel very confident that we're okay, and then we discover we depend on something sitting right that's highly, very vulnerable, sitting outside our fence line.
Yes.
Angela Gendron, Canadian Centre for Intelligence and Security Studies. I wonder if any of you have considered, apart from the external threats, the insider threats. We know that Al-Qaeda has issued fatwas which very specifically say that this is on their agenda. And we know that al-Suri, a strategist for Al-Qaeda, has issued very detailed instructions as to how Islamist extremists should infiltrate organisations like oil companies, gas, etc., apart from civil authority constructors. So in looking outside of these threats coming in, we shouldn't ignore what might happen from inside. And whether you have any comments on that.
I could speak about really the last event that I discussed was the London Underground bombings. 3 of the 4 bombers were British-born citizens, and the 4th being from Jamaica was also a homegrown threat. So here, although they are not in industry, the ability for the ordinary citizen within that nation to get the training, find the connections in order to become, potentially a terrorist, is very real. And, being able to identify that threat early is very crucial to the process of mitigating it.
I think that it's always possible that terrorism attacks could be so-called proverbial inside job, where somebody knows about the facility because they got the information from somebody else. I mean, I remember in 1993 when they had the initial World Trade Trade Tower attack, and it was mostly in the parking lot, and it seemed to be like in the media, like all chemical engineers were like persona non grata, like, oh, you know how to do all that stuff. And I go, no, I don't know how to do all that stuff. I just know about the chemicals, but that doesn't mean I know about explosives. I think that it's possible that people within a certain profession, simply know how these things are put together. Like I know how a chemical plant is put together, so it's very possible that if I wanted to go to the other side and say, I could probably tell you how to destroy the place or destroy something that will take the plant out for probably a year or more.
We haven't been developing complex threat models. They exist out there, and they include insider threat. We've sat kind of at the interface of that when we take and look at risk, threat, vulnerability together. Another aspect that we're really starting to investigate it more deeply is that interplay between infrastructure and essential service and social cultural populations, and how they shape one another. Insider, outsider is all a part of that model.
You had a question?
I have 2 questions, actually. One is, after the Alaska incident, do you know if the U.S. tapped into any reserves that helped lower the price? Because that's an interesting draw. And then the second question is for Scott. The transportation industry had their ideal security measures. What would that affect beyond the price to ship something? Is that like a 20% increase, a 50% increase, a 100% increase? And what's like a realistic next step to get there?
I honestly, as far as the increase in carrier costs, would definitely be an impact on the industry as a whole. To be perfectly honest, I don't have any numbers that I could give you, but you would definitely. It's a matter of, that's where the incentive part comes in, is in order to balance that out, you need to incentivize the supplier. Why are they?
Is it a large enough cost where it could effectively double the price of everything?
I think it could be unbounded, to be quite honest, right? If something's completely secure, as the old adage, it's also completely useless. Because, so now you're at a trade-off. You're always doing that risk analysis. How insecure what kind of risk can you take? And that influences the cost.
Vincent?
There was a second question.
My first question.
Yeah, and then following the Alaskan incident, international imports were increased in the time following that, so that could have made up for that price drop.
Okay. Yeah, I have I'd like to direct it to Scott. It's a comment and then a question, and I think that the two are related. At least they're related in my mind, so you can be the judge of that. First, in terms of the cargo plot that you mentioned, basically an observation that, interestingly, they did the dry runs of sending packages ahead, and they were able to track that using technology with literally following exactly where these packages were at any given moment in the world. And it's funny, while you were speaking, I actually opened up my iPad and went to the UPS, app, and don't have any packages coming at the moment, but you're literally able, on a moment-to-moment basis, track these packages throughout the world. And that's really for the convenience of the consumer, and it adds value to their product. They've recognized that that adds value to their product. At the same time, maybe this is an unintended consequence, it's also a vulnerability. It's a very interesting form of virtual pre-operational surveillance, what we used to call, when kind of considering the traditional terrorist model of the guy with the sunglasses standing across the street from the federal building taking pictures. But it's an interesting form of that. And that incident also points up the importance of intelligence, particularly human intelligence, because that's how the case was actually prevented. It was because somebody went down to Yemeni intelligence and kind of ratted them out. Here's the question part, which I think is related. As a professional, you're in the cargo business, and you were speaking about CTPAT and the importance of businesses and shippers to reorganize their security and to become part of that program. Business behavior is typically changed through incentives and regulation, and we tend not to like the regulations, and but the best way to change their behavior is a combination of carrot and stick. Are shippers and the businesses that you're dealing with, are they starting to realize that a secure cargo, a secure supply chain and a cargo chain is product value? That actually, just as UPS recognizes that that's a value that's added to their product, and maybe the reason we go with them rather than FedEx or that kind of convenience. Are they starting to realize that security, if security is built in, it's actually a product value, and that might overcome the cost?
Without an external incentive.
Yes, without it, yeah.
That's.
Well, I think there's a mix right now in the field. I mean, I think it's basically cost-driven. If the product is worth more by the individual unit, you're seeing a turnaround where they are getting more pressure on the carriers. They want to know what their end users' agreements are with their carriers, so that when risk does transfer, is this unit going to get to the final consumer, or is it going to be lost in transit at that point, or be subcontracted out to someone that they're unfamiliar with. One of the challenges that we see overcoming is providing the scenario to the low-end cargo unit, whether it be paperclip, as an example, is trying to explain to that person that, yeah, we're your insurance cover, we'll pay you if that shipment's lost. But what happens when your customer X doesn't get your shipment, because you didn't implement the correct security measures ahead of time? So as far as without incentives, is you have to paint, I always call it the midnight phone call, that because you didn't put a little bit more on the front end, now you might have lost your biggest client. So.
Thank you. Yuchachi, is it a quick question? Because I'm getting a high sign to it.
Make a comment on what Vincent said. One of the things that also has to happen is like the sender, or in the case of a seller of a product, needs to take a responsibility for what goes into the shipping system. In other words, anybody can put something in there. Just as an example, like I think in the late 80s, early 90s, there was an event where I think militants from the Middle East were buying chemicals from Europe. And somebody actually asked me in the airport, are you guys selling that stuff to these guys? And the answer was no, I don't think we're selling any of that stuff, because responsible companies, and there's this chemical weapons convention that's out there, which is supposedly the civilized world, of which most people are not selling these kinds of things to other people. You know, they want to know who their purchasers are. Of course, it's not a perfect world, and this stuff does happen. But it, you know, it can't all be on the shipper to have to be brought to saying, "Hey, you sent this in the mail to me," and you know that type of thing.
Okay, one last question, and we have to go ahead, you Chichi.
Okay, Mike. If America is cut off from one of their major gasoline sources, Nigeria, for instance, what resiliency plan do you have to survive?
I mean, honestly, I'm not sure we have it. We have one, to be real. Like, I don't know if we have a specific plan in terms. So if Canada shut off our oil supply or something like that, if we had something go wrong with Canada and we lost that oil, I don't know if we would have a plan in order to make up for that. We would have to. Our goal would probably be to increase imports from the other countries such as Nigeria or Saudi Arabia. But if they were not to cooperate, we obviously don't have the domestic capability to produce all our oil domestically. So we would have to both cut back on our usage of oil and then also increase our imports from international sources.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's give our panelists